Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Ask the Expert session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paula Hanford. I am the CEO of PSC Support, and I am absolutely delighted this afternoon to be joined by, I'm calling her Jenny, but Jennifer Towey, who is a specialist hepatology and transplant dietitian. Jenny is based in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, which many of you here today will be under that hospital. And it's an absolutely brilliant hospital to be in. I first met Jenny at the information day, the face-to-face information day in Birmingham, where Jenny spoke jointly on a session on diet and exercise, which went down really well. So we thought we'd repeat it at this Ask the Expert session. So as always, I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Jenny for giving up. I think it's probably your lunch hour, is it, Jenny?
Almost, yeah.
To join us today and to present to us today. I'm really happy to bring sessions like this. It's a really popular session. We've had nearly 200 people register for this session, which I think is a bit of a record actually for the Ask the Expert sessions. So as I said earlier, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat as we go along. So welcome, Jenny, to this Ask the Expert session. We are absolutely delighted you could join us. And would you like to start your presentation?
Thank you, Paula. I will just share my slides. And can you see those okay?
We can, thank you. If you put it on. Perfect.
So yes, thank you and welcome to everyone who is joining live here for the next hour. I have got some slides to hopefully cover just some of the basic sort of topics and questions that I feel perhaps of interest to you all. But yes, as Paula said, feel free to send in any questions for anything that needs more clarification or anything I haven't discussed, and I will do my best to answer them. So the aims of this sort of session, all through my slides, are to understand what it means to eat for health and the role of diet in PSC. And also, I think it's really important to consider your individual needs and the importance of early intervention, and to consider how sort of dietary changes may change over time as well. So we know that diet can impact many things, and that's why I think it's always such a popular topic. But generally, there are perhaps things that it might influence that you don't always think about. So things like your sleep, for example, your diet can certainly have an influence there. And I think more so now as clinicians, we're actually considering just sleep hygiene and thinking about sleeping habits as something that's really important, that we do need to be asking about and considering and supporting you with. Obviously, things like your energy levels, your diet is going to have a big influence there. And we know that fatigue is a big challenge in PSC in particular. So we want to be making sure that we're supporting that through nutrition. Your physical activity and your exercise, your nutrition goes hand in hand with that. And also your mood as well, which perhaps we don't always make a direct link to. And of course, I don't think I could do a talk to you all without talking about the microbiome. This is something that has become more of a hot topic in recent years, and rightly so. We're starting to understand this a little bit more now. We don't know enough yet to say for sure that this is exactly what you need to do, or as clinicians, we need to be advising. But we have a better understanding, and we have a good understanding that we know we need to be focusing on it. And I know as individuals, this is often something that's important to you as well, because rightly so, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to support yourselves. So for those who aren't as familiar with the microbiome, essentially, there are trillions of gut bacteria living in our gut microbiota, which is within your bowel. And the research is suggesting that diet can really influence the microbiota. And this is important because it's thought that it can actually support lots of things, including things like your brain function, your immune system, inflammation, lots and lots of things that it can support. And on the reverse of that, your diet can really influence your gut bacteria, essentially. So the balance of that gut bacteria. And also, if you are someone who requires lots of antibiotics for treatments of infections, for example, those types of medications can have, unfortunately, a negative impact on your microbiome. So we want to be making sure that you are aware what you can do to support the balance of that bacteria as best as you can. And how can we do this? So I will be talking through mostly, obviously, from a diet perspective. There are lots of research going on now looking at how other methods could be supporting your gut bacteria. I know there's a hot topic looking at fecal transplants now, but you might be pleased to hear I won't be sort of focusing on that so much today. So I wanted to just talk to you about dietary fibre, because I think it's a nutrient group that doesn't really get much recognition or much discussion at all, but it's actually a really important food group that we need to really focus a little bit more on. Now, before I talk about this in more detail, there may be some of you who are looking at this sort of lovely picture of all these different foods and thinking, I can't eat any of those, I can't tolerate them. And that's okay. For many reasons, people can struggle to digest, particularly your more fibrous foods. And in particular, if you do also have IBD, I appreciate that these foods can also be a challenge. But what I will say is, where you can, look at introducing and having a variety of different fibrous foods in your diet as best as you can. And there are ways to adjust these types of foods so that they're still providing you with some fibre without perhaps those potentially some uncomfortable symptoms that may be associated with them. But when we're talking about supporting the microbiome with fibre, we're looking at your plant-based foods more so. And these are things like your vegetables, your fruits, your legumes, so things like your lentils and pulses, whole grains, and also nuts and seeds. And actually, it's recommended to try it for the sort of just general recommendation is to try and get around 30 plant-based foods in across the week, which is actually can be quite difficult if these in particular aren't foods that you're used to having. But the benefit of this is that your gut bacteria really favours a range of different types of fibres. So your bacteria within your gut will essentially feed off these fibres and ferment them and produce something what we call short-chain fatty acids, which are actually thought to really support, again, things like reduced inflammation, support your immune system. So generally favour better health outcomes if you have a good range of these in your diet and a good balance of bacteria. And the reason I'm talking about this is because whilst, again, we don't fully understand it, there is some thought that the microbiome can play a role in perhaps development or certainly progression of PSC. And this is something that I know is an important question as to how this can be supported. So where you can, try and keep your diet diverse as possible. And I think a simple way to think about it is about eating the rainbow. So that's quite a nice way to sort of think about it over the week. Try and keep your diet as colourful as possible. And that's essentially a surefire way that you're getting a good range of these fibrous foods within your diet. And again, if you feel that a lot of these foods you're not able to tolerate, that is okay. This isn't essential, but where you can, try and get those fibre foods in. If you struggle with them, you can perhaps take some of the skin off a little bit. You can cook them so that they're really soft. You could mash them down or just have them in really small quantities and build up your tolerance to them. That can also help if at the moment you're struggling with these types of foods. And then generally thinking about eating for health. So here on this slide is, if you're not familiar, is a picture of the Eat Well guide, which is a government guide. It's very generic, so it isn't individual. So I wouldn't necessarily focus too much on the portion guide, so to speak. But I put it up here just to sort of really focus on the different types of food groups, so we could talk through why it's important to have a range of those. So I've briefly touched on the fruit and vegetable section, which is that big green section. So that's all of, your fiber as well as vitamins and minerals. Your amber section, again, is quite a large portion, and that's your carbohydrates. So I will talk about carbohydrates in a little bit more detail in a few slides, but essentially your carbohydrate foods are things like your breads, rice, pastas, and all your grains. And they're a really important food group. So they're essentially your quick energy provision to the body and to support your liver. And that doesn't matter if you're quite early on in your diagnosis, or if you've got quite advanced PSC. Carbohydrates are a really important staple part of your diet. Your pink section sort of near the bottom is your proteins. So that's your plant-based proteins or your meat proteins. And then to the right of that is your dairy products. So a good portion of those throughout the day, getting a good mixture of different protein sources. So again, where you can, your animal and non-animal protein sources, it's good to try and get a variety of those because they offer different, what we call amino acids, so different types of proteins within those. If you're not able to tolerate your animal dairy sources, or you just don't like them, or you'd prefer to have non-animal sources of your dairy foods, I would just say, just make sure that you're getting some added calcium with those to think about your bone health. But also just check the protein content of some of the non-animal dairy sources. So things like your coconut milks and your almond milks, for example, just check, because some of them are actually really low in protein or don't really have any in at all. So again, that's where it's helpful to try and get a good mixture of different food groups. So I guess my key here from the previous slide and this slide is to think about getting a diverse range of different foods as best as you can. And this is important because getting the right balance of nutrients can help provide the correct balance of function for your body, essentially. It can help maintain your weight, and again, help with things like your mood, your sleep, your brain function, your activity levels. So where you can, just try and get it, be as diverse as possible. So then we're going to move on to what may change with PSC. So again, it will depend where you're at in terms of your diagnosis, but particularly for those who might be early on in your diagnosis, it's not something that I guess is thought about so much as to how things may change. But actually, if you start to progress with PSC, and particularly if your liver becomes what we call cirrhotic, so scarred over time, that can really impact on the way that your liver can essentially use the energy from your food. And one of the things it can stop doing is actually storing spare energy. And that's what we call glycogen. So that's stored glucose. And it stops doing that essentially because over time there may not be enough healthy cells and tissue within the liver to do that. And the reason that's important to know is because if you don't have that backup store of glucose anymore, I tend to think of it like a backup generator. That backup generator's gone. So if you're then not eating very regularly, or you have long gaps in between your eating, or particularly overnight, you can only rely on the food that you have eaten at each meal. And that will only last so long in the body, in particular, depending on what it is that you've had, it may not last for very long at all. So if you're not getting regular glucose into you, your liver is very clever at trying to keep things going. And what it will do instead is it can go to your muscle and your fat stores and break those down. And that's where over time, particularly as the disease may progress and become more advanced, people may start to notice changes to their muscle mass, changes to their weight unintentionally, changes to energy levels, or things that might have felt really easy physically might now feel really hard, or just climbing the stairs might feel difficult, carrying your weekly shop might become more difficult. It's those really practical things that over time you might sit back and go, well, actually, that's not very easy now. And it may be because this is happening. There may also be some subtle changes to absorption as well, and I have got another slide on this, but over time, absorption can change as well. And that typically is because of those changes in the bile flow within the liver, particularly if you become more jaundiced, or the scarring within the bile ducts progresses. It may impact on the way that you can absorb and digest your food as well. And that's where we need to think again about how we might need to approach sort of pattern of eating, but also the types of foods that you're eating as well. So this is something that I think is important to think about even if you're in that early stage of diagnosis. It's about how you can maintain and optimize your muscle mass and your weight now. If you're in the later stage of that diagnosis and a little bit more progressive, and you might be noticing some of these symptoms, if you're not getting support with that already, that's something that definitely would warrant a referral to a dietitian to ensure that you're getting that specialist assessment and also that tailored advice to you. So I did just mention about changes to absorption. So we know that bile acids are important for the digestion of fats in the gut, and also for carrying sort of toxins and other substances away from the liver. And as you will know, that as you get that scarring and that structuring in your bile ducts, whether that's in and out of the liver, that can reduce that bile flow. Essentially, your tunnel's becoming blocked a little bit, so that bile will back up and it won't be getting into the gut. So normally that bile flow should be flowing into the gut to help break down your dietary fats. So if you're not getting the right circulation of bile acids, and you're not getting the right bile flow from the liver into your gut, you may be experiencing some symptoms of what we call malabsorption, and you might hear it being referred to as steatorrhea. So this might be symptoms such as fatty or oily stools. They might change colour. They might be quite foul smelling or not flush very well. They might be quite loose in consistency, but not always. And you might get even just some subtle symptoms such as wind or bloating. You might have a whole range of these, or you might only have one. If you're getting any of these, again, it's important to flag this to your medical team. And if you're not seeing a dietitian already or a specialist nurse, then please do request that again for a tailored assessment. But generally what the advice would be if you're presenting with any of these symptoms is I would be looking at your diet to start with. So what are you eating? Are there fattier foods within your diet? Is there an association there? Is there certain foods that you're experiencing these with more? And typically it is those fattier, richer foods, because of that lack of bile and bile acids to break that fat down. So it's not to say that you would need to remove all fat from your diet, because actually dietary fat is really important for lots of things, and in particular to absorb certain fat soluble vitamins, so in particular your A, D, E and your K. Lots of people over time might find they need some of these vitamins supplementing. So often we see the medical team prescribing vitamin A and vitamin D as more of a protective measure sometimes, and that's okay. So again, if you've got any queries about that, check with your medical team. If you're presenting with any of these symptoms, it may be beneficial to have those levels checked or to have that supplemented. But essentially, looking at your dietary fat intake, don't remove it from your diet, but think about your cooking methods. To keep it really simple, just avoid anything really creamy, anything fried. And just look at the traffic light system can be helpful as well. So avoid anything that's really red when it comes to fat, and try and stick with greens and ambers as well. And this is all about looking at not only protecting your muscle mass and your function, but how you feel as well, because some of these symptoms can be quite uncomfortable. So any signs of these in any stage of your sort of journey, then do flag these up to your medical team. And then just to briefly move on how to maintain muscle mass, and this might be something that you hear quite a lot, and particularly if you're more advanced in your diagnosis, we do like to talk about muscle a lot, and that's because there's such a close link between the liver and the muscle. So it is a bit of a balancing act, and again, it will be slightly different for everyone, but broadly, think about your food groups, think about protein. Protein will help to stimulate muscle growth and recovery. But what often I find doesn't get talked about as much is the carbohydrates. So as I said, your carbohydrate intake will help to provide your liver with that ready available fuel. If you only really focused on protein and had quite a low carbohydrate diet, your liver will essentially use the protein for general energy provision first, and anything spare it would use to support muscle if it has anything left over. So you're not really of any benefit in just focusing on protein. You need a bit of carbohydrate there to provide your body with the energy and allow the body to then utilize that protein. So that's really key, I think. And of course, I couldn't talk about maintaining muscle mass without mentioning exercise and activity. They go hand in hand. If you can't do one or the other, if you want to support and maintain or even improve muscle mass and strength, you not only need to supply it with the right fuel, but you need to move your muscles as well. And just briefly, a really quick slide on how, as clinicians, we might be able to monitor your muscle mass. We have some measures that we can do at the bedside in clinic, and if you do come to the QE, you're probably quite familiar with these if you are seeing anyone in our service, but we can measure things like your hand grip strength. That can give us a bit of an idea about the power and fueling of your muscles. And we can do some really simple upper arm measures with a tape measure to measure your mid upper arm circumference, and tricep skin fold, which measures upper arm fat mass. These help us with the patients that we see just guide what's going on. Essentially, weight isn't always that reliable, and it doesn't really tell us what's muscle and what's fat or fluid. So we do like to use these as a quick bedside measure. But even if you're not getting these measured or you don't have access to a dietitian at the moment, you will know in yourself if your body composition is changing. Is your weight changing? Is your energy levels changing? Are your clothes fitting differently? Does your jewelry fit differently? And as I said, are you finding anything harder now that was manageable before? These are all really good signs for you to consider, monitor and flag to your medical team if things are changing, so that you can get the right intervention as soon as possible. And just briefly, there are supplements out there that can help to support your intake if needed. And again, depending on where you are in the country will depend on your access and availability of these. And also there's differences in people's palatability and preference and convenience as well. But there are a huge range of supplements out there. Again, if you're struggling with your appetite, if you feel you're not eating enough, if you notice you're losing weight, or you're just not sure if you're getting in what you need, speak to your medical team, see if you can get access to a dietitian linked with that, and see if you can get support with that intake, because there are things out there if you can't manage it just from your diet. And so that was a really sort of quick overview, but just to summarize, I think my key word from this whole talk, if you take anything away, is diversity, really. It's getting that varied diet in where you can. And I appreciate there will be things that will get in the way, life will get in the way, routine will get in the way, symptoms that you may be experiencing will get in the way. So don't put pressure on yourself if things don't aren't consistent all the time, but where you can, try and be diverse as possible, and do seek that support if you're finding that actually thinking about this now, you're not quite getting this right. It doesn't feel that this kind of fits in with you. Do let your medical team know and see what support that you can get. So that's it from me in terms of slides. Paula, I'll hand over to you if you've got any questions to send my way.
There are indeed a load of questions. Jenny, I thought that was absolutely brilliant, really informative. Shall we start on the questions so we can fit in as many as...
Got a live chat. Sorry, just let themselves in. Apologies.
No problem at all. I've had a question about protein, and the person who's asked the question said that sometimes she's heard people say that protein isn't good when the liver isn't functioning well. Is that true?
So this is a really old way of practicing, essentially. So there used to be really commonly practiced that protein was actually reduced, or it was thought that it needed to be reduced, and this went back to linking it with a symptom of liver disease called hepatic encephalopathy. So it was, which is essentially a buildup of ammonia from protein waste products, which can trigger certain symptoms, particularly things like confusion, disorientation, etc., from essentially a waste product of protein. However, we know, and we've known for some time now, that actually that's not true. There isn't a direct correlation with that. And actually, if you're breaking down muscle through not getting the right nutrition and enough protein, that actually will increase your ammonia level potentially just as much. So essentially, no, it's very old practice. There will be some circumstances where a really high intake of protein isn't advised, but generally for most people, you want to be aiming for somewhere between 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of your body weight. And again, that will depend on where your weight is at the moment. Are you losing weight? How much support is your liver needing with additional protein? But generally, I would say most people will be getting probably not enough protein in, and definitely not too much. So please don't feel that you need to be avoiding protein.
Thanks for that, Jenny. We've got a couple of questions on weight, specifically losing weight. Somebody struggles to keep weight on. What's the best way of achieving that? But also the other question, when this person gets ill with PSC, he or she loses weight very quickly. And so how do we keep the weight on? And this person is also asking, should you become a little bit overweight for those periods of time when you lose weight due to your PSC flaring up?
Yeah, no, these are really good questions, actually, and something we see quite a lot. And it's really common, yes, when you do get those flare-ups to lose weight, because your energy needs increase. It's something we call catabolism. So people can become quite catabolic, which just means your demand for energy from the body really increases. And often in those periods, it's times where appetite is down or really reduced. And I find often that, particularly if you're in hospital for it, it's not always the best stimulating environment to support your food intake as well. So I guess part of that question was, should you gain a little bit of weight when you can? It's definitely not going to do you any harm, but I would say it's, again, being mindful of what that weight is composed of. So if we're talking about the body composition that I briefly mentioned, where you can and when you can optimize, work on improving that muscle mass, definitely. That will put you in good stead if you were to have periods where you did lose a little bit of weight. The more muscle you have, the more preserved it is, and it gives you that little bit of backup. So when you feel well enough to, it's thinking about, yes, optimizing your intake when you've got the appetite, but also thinking about your activity and exercise levels. That will help to support the right kind of weight. That will support there when you do have those times where perhaps you're not feeling as well, or your body's needing a bit more, and you may subsequently lose some weight. But it's really difficult. I appreciate that when you're not feeling well, you've got all these symptoms, you're on lots of different antibiotics potentially, and you just can't control that weight loss. I would say the key is, one, don't overthink it too much. Try not to put too much pressure on yourselves. And I know particularly, I see it a lot in clinic, it's really hard. Family members worry as well, and that can put a lot of pressure on you. It's really hard for other people to understand when you don't feel like eating and they're seeing you not eating, to sort of tell you just to eat. It can get really frustrating, and it can be really difficult to hear that on the other side. So I would say little and often is really important. And I think that's something that's fairly adaptable and approachable even in that circumstance. At that point, I tend to say to my patients, I'm not worried too much about what it is you're eating so specifically at that point. If it's a short period of time where your appetite is just very low, don't overthink it too much. If there is whatever you think you can eat, just eat it. That's the most important thing. There's no point sitting there thinking, well, actually the dietitian or the doctor told me I have to eat this, this, and this, but I don't fancy any of it. But instead I could eat this. Just go for it. Go for what you fancy. Go with your appetite. In the short term, that's not going to do you any harm. It's actually going to be a benefit because it's supporting you to minimize your fasting times. It's protecting the liver a bit better. It's protecting your muscle. And there will come a time again where you have some better days where you can try and kind of be a little bit more focused on that balance in your diet. But again, in that circumstance, I think it's really important for you, if not already, you're communicating this with your medical team and trying to get access to a dietitian for that specialist assessment, because it may be that you need extra support with your diet. So, for example, with prescribed nutritional supplements, that's where in that circumstance, these would probably come in at this point, to find a way to top up your food intake to minimize any weight loss or stop it if possible.
Sure. You mentioned the nutritional supplements there, and one of the questions is about trying to make them taste a little better. In particular, Renapro shots. Is there a way to make them taste any better is the question, especially as this person feels sick all the time, so that must be really tough.
Yeah, and it definitely. So it's really interesting with the supplements, because I find it's so like people are so different with their taste preferences. We have, I've come across people who really, get on with the supplements like the Renapro shots really well, and some who just don't at all. But I would say with the Renapro shots, you don't have to take them just as they are. So you can dilute them. That's what often I would be advising to patients. So they tend to mix quite well with sugar-free sort of fizzy drinks, so things like tonic water or just something a little bit flavored that's of similar flavor, that can help. Maybe you can mix them into other drinks. You can try mixing them as ice cubes, or sometimes we have people making them into ice lollies, for example. Again, it's diluting them. It's thinking of taking them a slightly different way. They won't be so concentrated. But also sometimes it's the psychology of thinking, oh, I've got to take another one, particularly if you're on quite a few. Mixing up how you're preparing them might help with that. But if none of that works, they're not the only supplement out there. That's also really important to know. Sometimes, and we see it here, you have doctors who, particularly if it's a doctor that's done the prescription, you might favour certain supplements over others for no particular reason, but there is variety out there as well. And if you're someone who already has quite a lot of sickness, quite a lot of nausea, they're not always the best supplements for that. So they do come in other options, particularly the Renapro powder comes in a powdered option, a whey protein powder, which is flavorless. You can mix that with milk or water, for example. Or there are other companies that do some small volume, high protein products. So ask the question to whoever prescribed them to you, whether it's a nurse or a doctor, ask for some alternatives and see if there's anything else that you can tolerate better.
Fantastic, that's great advice. We've got a question about celiacs. With so many people with PSC who are also celiacs or have celiacs in the family, why isn't everyone with PSC recommended a gluten-free diet?
I guess there's not the evidence or the need for it necessarily. So we wouldn't be advocating sort of adjusted diets such as that unless there's a clinical need. Of course, if there's not a clinical need, but it's a individual preference, then that's okay. But unless you're getting symptoms associated with eating gluten, there isn't a need for it, and it can potentially reduce your options of different carbohydrates as well. So where we can, we try and encourage keeping that diet varied. So it's just because there isn't a clinical need for it, and there's no evidence to suggest that we would need to be advising that.
Okay, thank you for that. Question here about anti-sickness medications. Somebody wants to try and keep their food down, so wondered if there's any anti-sickness medications they can take in order to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a question to put back to your medical team, because there are lots of different types of anti-sickness medications, and there are some that aren't as well advised with any form of liver disease. So it's definitely a question to go back to your GP or your medical team. And it depends on the type of sickness and the pattern of sickness as to which one would be better for you. There are a few that we would favour in our clinics. But again, it's probably a question to put back to your medical team. But I would say when and if you are prescribed something that's advised specifically for you, make sure you're taking it in a good amount of time before you try and eat something. So that's something that often doesn't always get discussed or encouraged when these medications are given out. But try and take something 30 to 60 minutes before trying to eat something so that it's in your system, rather than waiting for the sickness to start and then taking it. You're chasing your tail a little bit. So try and get on top of it before it happens. But definitely speak to your GP or your gastro or hepatologist as to which one might be the best specifically for you.
Thank you for that. We've had a question about intermittent fasting. You mentioned fasting in one of your answers earlier, but intermittent fasting. Are you able to advise how prolonged intermittent fasting is impacting the patients with small duct PSC? Is there any?
I don't know any evidence specifically for that with small duct PSC. Generally, we wouldn't be advocating intermittent fasting for all the reasons sort of I spoke about in some of my slides, that actually you want to make sure that your liver's getting a regular supply of fuel, and that's regardless of any sort of stage of PSC that you're at. The risk with intermittent fasting is there's a couple of risks with it, really. It doesn't help to keep your blood sugar stable. So that can be potentially a bit of a challenge with your liver having to then try and do the extra work to find the balance with getting enough fueling supply to keep your blood sugar level stable. That potentially isn't then going to make you feel great. That might worsen things like fatigue. It might affect your sleep, your mood, etc. Obviously, intermittent fasting will naturally likely to reduce your weight. And again, for some people that's okay, but is it the right kind of weight? So if that isn't being monitored and assessed, you are risking losing muscle mass, which obviously we don't want to be encouraging. But also generally you're reducing the chance of getting a wide variety of different food groups and nutrients in over the day. So if it's something that you do consistently over time, you're risking not getting enough of each type of nutrient in each type of food group, and longer term that can then have challenges in itself. We want to make sure you're getting enough of all the right type of different food groups in. So that I don't know any evidence specifically for small duct PSC. Generally, we wouldn't be advocating intermittent fasting at all, and actually we'd be advising the opposite, really trying to minimize that fasting time as much as you can.
Thanks, Jenny. I've got a question here that was given to us beforehand about esophageal varices grade 3. They've just been diagnosed with that. Could you advise a nutritious diet for that diagnosis?
But there's actually no specific recommendations for diet, excuse me, related to varices at all. So essentially that will be a consequence, I presume, of portal hypertension, which is one of the symptoms of liver disease. So there's nothing specifically for the varices we'd be recommending that will help with that per se. If you're on a banding program, for example, or you're needing those banding, you might find that you're asked to adjust your diet for a short period afterwards, and mostly that's just texture modification. So you may be asked to change your foods to a bit of a soft diet, have nothing really sharp and scratchy that might risk knocking those bands to start with. But other than that, there isn't any evidence for anything specifically to help support or manage the progression or change of those varices over time.
Thanks, Jenny. I've got a question about probiotics. So in PSC with UC, is the intake of probiotics in the form of pills suggested?
So again, there isn't a set guidance on this. It's not a suggestion that we're as dietitians or clinicians advise that we need to be advising everyone to be taking them, but certainly that there is a role for them. So I did just focus on diet in my couple of slides around dietary fiber, but of course, there are lots of different modified probiotics that you can buy, whether it's in liquid form or in tablets. Again, check with your overseeing clinician first. Often there are live cultures in these probiotics and they're not suitable for everyone, particularly if, for example, if you're immunosuppressed. It's important to check that first with a pharmacist or your clinician. But definitely there is some good evidence that probiotics, whether it's in the natural food form, so a lot of those dietary fiber foods that I talked about are natural pre and probiotics. But if you prefer to take them in a tablet or a liquid form, again, just check that specific one with your medical team. But there certainly is some evidence of a role in helping to support the microbiome in that circumstance. It is worth doing your research on them a little bit because there are a lot of them out there and they've all got different strains of probiotics in them. And those strains, they're different evidence for different strains for different causes. So there will be certain strains that will be advised more so for ulcerative colitis, for example. So if you are wanting to take some and you've got the go-ahead from your medical team, do a little bit of research first as to what the most recommended type of probiotic strain is going to be more suitable for you.
Thank you very much for that. I've got a question about ketosis. And the question is this: rather than carbohydrates, glucose and glycogen storing, what about ketosis?
So we generally wouldn't recommend ketosis at all.
Can you just explain what that is for?
So it's a breakdown of your fat stores, essentially. So you're utilizing your fat essentially for energy. So as I mentioned, when you're not getting enough storage, when you run down your glycogen stores, they're not replaced, and you're not getting enough carbohydrate in to provide readily available energy, your liver will either generally go to your protein stores first, so your muscle, because it's a really quick, easy thing to break down to provide energy. You can sometimes, people's metabolisms will be slightly different, and depending on how you're eating and what you're eating, it may be that you can protect your muscle mass enough, but actually you're still not quite getting enough calories in, or you're not quite eating at the right times, that instead you might go into your fat stores instead. And that generally over time can be what we call ketosis. And particularly if you're not getting any carbohydrates at all, but you're eating quite a high fat diet, essentially over a number of days, over a number of weeks, that can put you into ketosis. We don't generally recommend that. And again, for all the reasons that I spoke about, it's important not to miss out these key food groups. Overall, there's not really going to be any benefit to it. it depends on your reason for wanting to do it. If it's for weight loss, there are other ways of losing weight. And again, you risk not getting the right nutrients in, you risk not getting the right balance in your body composition, and you still risk reducing your muscle mass. But again, if it's more for anything in terms of, it depends on the reason. So if it's for actually supporting or delaying any progression of PSC, I'm making some assumptions here because I'm not quite sure the reason behind it. But there's no evidence for those types of fasting diets to actually support offset any progression of PSC or support it in any way. So if it's purely for weight loss, I personally wouldn't be advocating that. I would be looking at other ways of helping to reduce or manage weight, for example, if that is the reason.
Thank you, Jenny. So we've got a question here about couple of drinks. So is there any recommendations, or what are the recommendations for drinking coffee or alcohol with PSC, and alcohol with PSC?
So in terms of alcohol, there isn't any specific recommendation. I guess, again, that's something to go back to the medical team with as to what they would be advising you specifically. There's no pros to drinking alcohol, unfortunately, I would say, apart from your enjoyment and that being part of normal life for many people. But again, that's just something to check with your medical team. But in terms of coffee, yes, there is some evidence, and it's been around for a little while now, that having some coffee in your diet can just generally help to support liver function. It's not, the be all and end all. It's not going to work wonders, but certainly there has been some evidence to show that it can be a supportive factor in terms of your liver function, essentially. So if it's something that you enjoy, certainly a couple of cups of coffee a day is going to do you no harm.
Met somebody at the information day who was absolutely delighted with that piece of information when I think you said it, actually, so that was fantastic for her. Somebody has asked about liver cleanses and say that they've been recommended, some people have recommended them to them. Is this something they should look into?
So essentially, the role of your liver is to detoxify your body. Alongside your kidneys, it's there to filter out toxins. So there isn't anything really that you can do supportively to replace that. If you were to, again, I don't know the specifics of what's been advised here, but generally, if you're going to go on a sort of cleanse, from my understanding, that would involve perhaps some fasting, really restricting what you're having, perhaps only having, I don't know, certain drinks, for example. Again, without the details, I'm making some assumptions, but there isn't anything that you can do positively to cleanse your diet, your liver in a sense, or your body, doing it that way. It's an unfortunate consequence that as liver disease progresses over time, the function of detoxification is challenged, it reduces, but there isn't anything that we would safely recommend that you do to replace that, because again, of all the risks I've spoken about, if you're not getting a good balance of nutrients in, if you're not protecting your muscle mass and getting enough calories and protein in, you're at risk of essentially breaking down muscle and having other worse health outcomes. So generally, I wouldn't be advocating any kind of cleansing diet at all for those reasons.
Thanks, Jenny. Question here about plant-based foods, and I know you talked about them a little bit in your presentation. And the poster has said that they've thrived when they followed a plant-based diet. Would you recommend that?
Definitely, like I said, if you can, variety is the key. And I think that's something that, if I think back to my practice when I started, all those years ago, it wasn't ever something that we really talked about much. Our focus was always about nutrition support and just protecting weight and muscle mass. But actually now we know so much more and we see the benefits, and patients do report that themselves. So diversity is key. So where you can, really try and get that variety in your diet for all of those different and benefits not only to your gut microbiome, but it will help expand your food choices as well and give you more variety. So of course it is only going to be of benefit where you can.
And do you think diet is associated with the progression of the disease? Somebody's asking here.
So again, we don't know for sure really, but again, that I would say if that is the case, the thought is potentially linked with the microbiome and the fact that essentially you're not getting it is to do with the blood flow from the gut into the liver. So that big vein that travels, the blood travels up from the gut into the liver. It's thought that if you've not got the right balance of good and bad bacteria, so microbiomes, potentially those more bad bacteria might be causing some of these changes and problems within the bile ducts and within the liver to cause or potentially progress PSC. It's not confirmed. We don't know enough of that, but it's definitely thought that that might be the case. So where you can, and again, I guess I stress that where you can, because I appreciate for everyone, you might be a little bit more advanced, or, you know, for that person that did write in earlier and say they're really struggling with nausea and appetite's not so good, you know, you're not potentially going to be able to focus on variety as much as possible, you know, as much as you might want to. But where you can and where you've got that opportunity, really do focus on that variety in your diet, and do focus on prioritizing your nutrition, because it has a whole heap of benefits, not only for general body functions, activity, energy, but potentially for supporting your liver as well.
Thank you, Jenny. There's a question here which I can answer, and that's about is this webinar going to be available after today? And it will be. It will be available on our YouTube channel if everybody wants to watch it back or wants to recommend it to anybody else. It should be up within a few days, week at the most, on our YouTube channel. Just put in PSC support and the YouTube channel will come up in YouTube. So, question here. I used to love a tikka masala once a week, but read about how this can irritate things. Am I able to have an occasional treat like this, or is it best to avoid completely? I also have Crohn's, so this would depend on if flares are under control. I also need to lose weight, as I put on a lot of weight after steroids for over 6 months. How can I do this safely with both conditions? And she says, thank you.
No, so first part of that question, of course, if it's not to say that everyone's going to experience the same symptoms with each food, so it's you eat to your tolerance essentially. If you can tolerate those kind of foods, for some people, those creamier, richer sauces, for example, they might not tolerate so well. And for some people, it's the spiciness of those can find a bit irritating. But if that isn't the case for you, then of course you don't need to be restricting and avoiding those foods for those reasons. And then I guess the second part of that question is about weight management, essentially. So again, it is very individual, but to be quite, I guess, generic, it is looking at, you know, basic things like portion sizes. You know, are you eating because you're hungry, or is it sometimes a bit of habit? Can you change your routine a little bit? Might that help? Are you getting enough fluids in? And also looking at the types of things that you might be eating. So where possible, if there are some sort of richer, creamier sauces, if sort of more fried things, look at swapping them for little alternatives. It doesn't mean you have to miss out, but if, for example, a meal like that, again, without knowing the details, avoid fried rice, just swap it for some boiled rice, for example, so you can have a bit of that sauce. It's about compromise sometimes. Look at the portion size of it. Do you need to eat it all? Can you reduce it a little bit and try and have something again, you know, a few hours later? Will that make 2 meals and you can enjoy it twice then instead of having it all in one go? So it's those little things can be helpful, but also looking at activity levels is important as well. So if you're currently not very active, or you think actually I probably could step it up and push myself to the next level, again, that will really help in terms of weight management and supporting a little bit of weight loss as well.
Thank you. Probably only got time for a couple more questions. So this there are some foods that appear to increase inflammation, tomatoes as an example. Should these inflammatory foods be avoided?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, it's not something that I'd say we focus on so much. But I guess, yeah, there's certainly, lots of evidence out there around pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory foods. I can't say whether it's specifically been studied in PSC at all. It's not something to my knowledge that I know has. But it's something I'm now going to look up because it's a very interesting question. But I would say if those are the types of foods that you enjoy and you could incorporate in with your meals, then certainly they're going to be of no harm. And that it's likely they're going to have some benefit in supporting you, but I can't unfortunately say for sure that, yes, definitely make sure you're getting a good amount of those in, and that's really going to help with your PSC, because I don't know that for sure, unfortunately.
I think we can squeeze two questions in. So, because there's so many, which has been brilliant. Is milk thistle or liver detox or teas? I know we've talked about that really, but milk thistle going to help?
In short, no. Is my response going to be to that? Um,
Okay. Do you want to?
no, yeah, my response, yeah, in short, is going to be no.
Okay. This is a very festive question because I too like sprouts. Not many people do. But the question is this: I'm unable to resist a sprout or two. To what effect will sprouts have on the system and PSC? And do you recommend steam or boiling them to keep the vitamins in?
Yeah, so yeah, very festive question. So sprouts will have no impact, positive or negative, on PSC. So if you enjoy them, go for it. But yeah, steaming can certainly help keep the nutrients in if you boil them. Again, it depends how much you boil them. If you boil them a lot, then of course some of that vitamins will be sort of lost in the water. So if you can steam them, if you can't, just boil them so that they're still fairly, they're not really, really soft essentially. And then you're still going to keep a lot of the vitamins within them. That's the same for any vegetables, not just sprouts.
Yeah. But very topical. About sprouts at this Ask the Expert. I think we're going to have to call an end to this Ask the Expert session. There are still loads of questions in the Q&A box to answer, and I'm so sorry we haven't got round to them all. But thank you so much, Jenny. I hope you have time to go and get yourself some lunch now after all
Yeah.
that talk about food.
Don't worry. But I will just say I'm happy to, if at some point you're able to send those questions through to me, I'm happy to answer them, and they can be I don't know, put out in some format, response, if that's helpful.
Oh, that would be wonderful. You're getting lots of clapping hands, hearts, thumbs up coming your way. So I think that was just a very, very informative session. You were very clear with your answers, and we really, really appreciate all of that and your time today, Jenny. Thanks so much. The next Ask the Expert session is a research update following on from the American Association of the Study of the Liver conference that's just happened in San Diego, I believe. And we've got Dr. Palak Trivedi from Birmingham also, who is going to give us the research update. That takes place on Tuesday, the 14th of January at 12:30. So not 12:30 in the night, but 12:30 midday. So we really hope you can join us for that. But thank you so much for everyone who has taken part in today's Ask the Expert, and especially to Jenny for joining us today. Thank you.